Yes, welcome everyone. All right, so I think it's a good time to go ahead and get started. So we would like, on behalf of Richard and I and the African American Studies program here at Widener, we would like to welcome you all to another installation of our Ngoma series. And we are very, very excited to have with us Ms. Aysha Ames, who is going to give her presentation titled The Georgetown Slave Sale: How Untold Stories Shape the Narrative of Truth and Reconciliation. And so to introduce our speaker, I'm going to read a little bit about her and then welcome her. And so Ms. Aysha Ames is the Director of Legal Writing at Fordham Law School, where she teaches the 1L Legal Writing course and helps develop the 1L, L.L.M, and advanced legal writing curricula. Prior to teaching legal writing, she served as an attorney with the United States Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights and worked to ensure equal access to education and to resolve complaints of discrimination. Aysha is a graduate of Rutgers University School of Law, JD, Rutgers University Graduate School of Education, Master's in Education, and Rutgers College, Bachelor's of Arts. Aysha is a descendant of the Georgetown Slave Sale, and her most recent scholarly project explores the ways in which the legality of slavery has resulted in many untold and hidden stories. So with that, I would like to welcome Ms. Aysha Ames.
Thank you for that, Jen, and thank you so much, Richard, for having me. I'm excited to talk about the work I've been doing. So let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay, so my name's Aysha Ames. As Jen said, feel free to pop any questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand. And for those of you that aren't eating lunch, and I'd invite you to turn on your camera if you're in a position to do so, just so I can see your faces and your reactions. But today I'm going to talk to you about the Georgetown Slave Sale. As Jen said, I am a descendant, and sort of how I came upon this journey. So going back. So today I'm going to talk about first Nace, who's my descendant, his story, kind of how I came to this work, Jesuits, Georgetown, and slavery, and the lasting impact of Jesuit slavery if we have the time, and then what's next. And hopefully there's time for a discussion. So how I came to this project. So I remember reading in the New York Times back in around April of 2015, I saw this article that talked about 272 slaves being sold at Georgetown to save the institution. Georgetown was struggling. They had all these Jesuit plantations and they had hundreds of slaves, and they needed money to kind of keep the institution running. So to do so, they sold slaves in what's called the Second Middle Passage. So they sold slaves. So it's like the Inter-America slave sale. So they sold slaves that went from the North to the South. And they sold, we now know it was not 272, it was closer to 300 slaves. And the value of that sale ranged from, in today's dollars, between 3.3 and 7.5 million dollars. So essentially saved the college and allowed them to be this grand institution for what it was. The article later went on to say that if you've got these surnames and you're from these parishes in Louisiana, and your family, and you're Black and you're Catholic, you were likely a descendant. So I remember reading that and saying it was interesting and thinking no more about it. Although my family's Black and does have Catholic ties, we are from Maryland. My dad's side is from Maryland, and I didn't think any more of it. It wasn't until my dad received a call later in October of that year that said that of those 272 slaves that were sold, we now know to be almost 300, several actually did not make it to Louisiana. They had run away. And that got me to thinking about our ties to the sale. So I'd like to tell you about is this man named Nace. So starting off with, here's my family tree. So we have Ignatius Butler Sr., who is my fourth grade grandfather. He was married to a woman named Bibiana Mahoney, who's my fourth great grandmother. And then both were enslaved by the Jesuits on Jesuit plantations in a place called St. Inigo's. And while they were enslaved, they had 15 children, the oldest of which was a male by the name of Ignatius Nace Butler, who married Anna Gal and also an Eliza Ann, also known by Eliza Ann. So Nace is here, and his parents and 14 of his siblings actually went to Louisiana on a ship called the Catherine Jackson, which was, and they're listed on the manifest as having gone. Nace, however, is listed as a runaway. And he was 19 at the time in 1838. He ended up having 10 children, and we'll talk about Nace in a bit, but here are his descendants. You can see John married Anna or Eliza Ann. She went by various names. They had children. They had a daughter named Susie, along with several other children. Susie had a son named George. George was my grandmother's father, and there's my father who married my mother. I won't put her maiden name just for the identity purposes. But let's talk about Nace. So here, if you look at the list of the manifest for the Catherine Jackson, you can actually see Nace Butler and his wife Phoebe. Nace at the time was 50, or Nace Senior, and his wife was 45. They tell height, weight, they tell race. So the manifest had a lot of information. Nace was listed later on in this manifest next to his name, where it lists his age, and along with the siblings, he's listed as runaway. Now Nace's story. So Nace, there isn't much known about Nace actually as to why he ran away or who helped him stay behind. There was some evidence that some Jesuit priests were against the sale. They thought that selling from various parts of the North to Louisiana would lead to particular cruelty. Even though the part of what the Jesuits, when they authorized the sale, they had certain conditions that, for example, they had to be sold to Catholic owners. They had to keep families together, and that they couldn't engage in any cruelty, as well as that they had to be that the slaves that were transported had to be able to maintain their ties to Catholicism and practice Catholicism. We know most of those things, if none of them were actually kept for those who went to Louisiana. However, Nace stayed behind, and it's believed maybe that members of like the Jesuits actually helped him stay behind, because he was in love with Eliza Ann, who was on a neighboring plantation that was not owned by Jesuits. The plantation itself was owned by the Jesuits, but it was being subleased by a different family. So that's part of the reason that they believe Nace stayed behind. But I think if you think about just the context of your entire immediate family just one day being gone, and you're left behind at 19, and what your story's told. So in thinking about Nace actually became, it's actually interesting. He doesn't appear again until 1870. So from that 1838 sale, we don't necessarily see any records of him until 1870. And that's the first census post-emancipation. And he's listed with his wife, Eliza Ann, and 10 children. And he ended up marrying Eliza Ann in 1847, but after that, there's nothing there. So Nace became like an elected delegate of the Republican Party. He was a trustee of the colored school. He was a marshal at the Grand Navy tournament for colored people. And he became the first Black person actually buried at the Catholic Church, which is known as St. Indigo's, which is the longest held parcel of land by the Jesuits in the world. So it's interesting that he's buried there. He's one of the original sort of Black Catholics, and we don't necessarily hear the story of Black Catholics in general. So that's Nace's story, and I think Nace's story really embodies how we think of kind of the intersection and what I'm researching of like race, property law, and Blackness, and that intersectionality. So to get there, we need to talk about the Jesuits, Georgetown, and slavery. So the Jesuits actually held thousands of acres in land across several plantations. So you can see the Jesuit plantations in Maryland, and they were on like the Jesuits came on the sort of the first voyages to the Americas. They arrived around 1630 with Lord Baltimore. And when they arrived, they were actually given property. So how you were provided property, you made an appeal to Lord Baltimore, and Lord Baltimore actually gave the Catholics property. Lord Baltimore was Catholic because the Catholics were escaping religious persecution back in England. And it's interesting when you think about religious persecution, and they were definitely oppressed, and it was dangerous to be Catholic in England because part of the belief was that if you were Catholic, you were not loyal to the crown, and you must be loyal to the crown. So Jesuits came to sort of establish this missionary work in the Americans, and also to advance Catholicism and to escape that persecution. Now, it's notable that when they came over, Jesuits were not poor. And they had these very wealthy connections, and most who came with, and those first people who came who weren't already here to America, they were wealthy, and they viewed this as a way to sort of expand their wealth and power. And it was especially true for if you were the second son. So if you were the first son and you were born, you were English, you got property, you got everything back in England. But if you were that second son or that third son, you took nothing. So many came and they were like, you know what, I can get property that I can't have here. And they came with those same types of holdings of what property was. And the Jesuits and the English gentry that came with them engaged in some questionable practices. So the Jesuits received land from Lord Baltimore, but they also negotiated with indigenous people for land. And we don't know what necessarily went into that negotiation, but we know that Lord Baltimore really was upset about it, because keeping in mind that you cannot have land that doesn't belong to the crown. And if you are getting land in ways from indigenous people using questionable motives, it sort of undermines the crown and how the crown views property and land. So the Jesuits had to relinquish some of the land that they got from indigenous people. And Lord Baltimore actually gave them about 12,000 acres. And if you think about how land is given, and just in property law, or anything is given, if you think about land given with no conditions, or anything given is provides you with a lot of power. So if you receive land, or if I gave you money and I give you this money, or I give you this property in what's called in the law fee simple, which means that you can do whatever you want with it, it's yours. So the Jesuits were actually received about 12,000 acres that way. And the important part of that is that they didn't have to pay any taxes or any fees on the land until they developed it. So they got this land that they could hold until they needed to use it. And they didn't have to do anything with it or pay for it. So if you think about just the power that sort of gives you, just holding those property rights. And they had this land and they needed people for this land. And around that time, the Jesuits were coming, so was the Atlantic slave trade. And the Jesuits amassed about 300 slaves. And you may ask, how did they get these slaves? They were furthering the Catholic mission. So they had a variety of ways of actually getting slaves. For example, people would donate them. So if you think about wealth and succession, they would bequeath their slaves, their enslaved human beings, to others, like to the Jesuits. The Jesuits also did a really complicated manner of property ownership, in that they kept the land and the people by making the Jesuits by making sure that only Jesuits could hold title in most cases. And if there were any threats of possibly anti-Catholicism in the colony, that they would transfer it to a layperson and then take that land back. So they really were sophisticated and knowledgeable, and the narrative that they came over as religiously oppressed individuals is true. However, it leaves out that portion. It also leaves out the portion that the Jesuits didn't participate in in any of the things that Lord Baltimore asked them to participate in, such as the Maryland General Assembly. So the Maryland General Assembly established the laws for the colony of Maryland, and they didn't participate because they kind of reclused themselves to these plantations because they were like, we are only about being Catholic. We are only about furthering our mission. However, by reclusing themselves, it allowed them sort of a willful ignorance as to what was going on with anti-Blackness. So when you think about anti-Blackness at that time and the laws that were placed, in order for the Catholics to be profitable, in order to have land, for that land to be profitable, you need labor. And they did that by sort of establishing a variety of just fundamental laws that dealt with anti-Blackness, which actually benefited the Jesuits in keeping their property. For example, and colonial Maryland was the first jurisdiction in the colonies to actually establish this connection with anti-Blackness. So so they first said in 1664 that all Negroes that were within the province of Maryland were declared slaves. And so basically you had to prove otherwise if you weren't. So if you said you weren't a slave, if you were Black, you now had to somehow show proof otherwise. And then there came this point as to which if you're a Christian, you can be baptized sort of out of slavery. It would definitely take you to this transition to indentured servitude. And that was outlawed in Maryland. And then other laws that were passed were, for example, any Black babies born into colonial Maryland were deemed to be Black and therefore enslaved. So no matter their paternity or maternity, there were a variety of laws that sort of intertwine the complexities of owning people as opposed to just owning property in other ways. And the Maryland General Assembly was just always going about ways in which they can kind of get around those laws, like the complexities of owning people and treating them as property. So by kind of reclusing themselves and not participating in these conversations, the Jesuits were like, that's just the way of the land, you must be slaves. But not really acknowledging the fact that they were willfully not participating. So they were feigning sort of this willful ignorance. And it was just a variety of laws. If you think about it, if you were a free white woman who had a relationship with a Black enslaved man, then your children were enslaved. And it was just all these ever evolving complexities that were going on. And then just marriage prohibited between white women and Black women. And if any children later were produced with that marriage, they would be enslaved. And then they added another caveat, and that if you were that white woman, you now became an indentured servant for 7 years. So it wasn't just just the ways in which anti-Blackness, the ways in which they were really pushing that the Jesuits just took as the law of the land to be able to kind of seclude themselves on these plantations and actually to maintain that property ownership. And so this presumption that Black people were inferior and therefore were entitled to be enslaved also followed some of the Jesuits' teaching. So they viewed themselves as being missionaries, as being the stewards, as being the holders of all that's right and true, and that they were instructed with sort of leading enslaved people into the right path. So they did things. So just some of the writings are particularly cruel. If you read about it, they talk about that Black people eat their babies, that they are particularly uncivilized, that they are lazy, just all these types of language that sort of reinforce the idea that of anti-Blackness and that they were entitled to be enslaved, and that was their moral duty to bring Catholicism to them. And so that's what really brings me back to this religious persecution of Catholics, and thinking about how the narrative that we're told repeatedly is that the Catholics came to the Americas to escape religious persecution. But what's left out of this story is, even though it's really hidden in plain sight, is that view of slavery, is how the Jesuits even enslaved people. And if you think about the Jesuits, there was also an article last week in the New York Times about how nuns were like, when nuns actually had their own line of slavery, and thinking about how that kind of goes into Georgetown's essential mission. So Georgetown's essential mission was originally they started off, they weren't charging tuition because the idea was to advance Catholicism, and they had slaves not only in the plantations, but in a variety of ways. So through that advancement of Catholicism, they also needed slavery to run the actual institution. Students brought slaves to campus. They hired out slaves to do various things. And if you think about just wealth, succession, and power, so not only did the Jesuits have these plantations, they also had this college that was perpetuating this mission. And they were educating people to perpetuate this mission under the guise that they were being religiously persecuted, and it's their job to kind of advance their mission. And if the first graduate of Georgetown College was actually went on to become the first Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And in doing so, there are hundreds of opinions, both of him as an attorney and as chief judge, and as a judge, that actually reflect this anti-Blackness and slavery. So it wasn't just the idea that they were only perpetuating this concept of slavery as it relates to actual people, but they were actually purporting educating others to kind of further those ideas into the world, which has sort of lasting consequences. And when viewing themselves as these moral stewards of property, they really took a singular focus that that stewardship really only applied when they wanted it to. So the ways they treated the enslaved wasn't particularly morally superior. There's just views of people sleeping on floors, what they fed them, that they were feeding them too much, what they wore, just tattered clothing, and what they were given, and sort of this idea that they were being benevolent sort of was all rooted in that anti-Blackness, was rooted in they were subhuman and that they needed to be saved, and that without them they couldn't go. They would not be able to participate fully in society. And then, so I want to just sort of bring it fast forwarded to the present before I got your thoughts. So in 2016, Georgetown issued an official apology, so saying that they were sorry for the wrongs. They also renamed one of its buildings, Isaac Hawkins Hall, in memory of the first name that's listed on the manifest and the 1838 sale document. And then Georgetown maintains records of the sale. They have the Maryland State Archives, the Maryland Province Archives, and other documents related to slavery. And even as of this past Saturday, March 18th, they established a new Georgetown Center for Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation. So it's basically, at this point, is that enough? And that's where I wanted to sort of leave the conversation to see if there's time to see your thoughts and for you to open up to ask questions.
Well, Aysha, thank you so much for this presentation. It's very thought-provoking and just very interesting overall. But yeah, let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
I have a quick one, really quick. Two things. For those that have that joined us late for whatever reason, I would strongly encourage you, in about a day or two, I will upload the link on YouTube. You got to see this from the beginning. This is amazing. I have such an emotional reaction. I'm going to let others get their question in, but thank you. Amazing work. And I would encourage others to look for the link that we're going to send out and watch it from the beginning. Thanks.
Okay, so Tangela, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Aysha, thank you so much for being here and sharing that information with us. I have two questions. Was your research the research is the research that led to Georgetown's response?
No, actually, it was not. I didn't start researching it until about 2019 because I had no knowledge of any of it, that we even had a connection to the sale. So that and I think it's interesting in and of itself, like why there's no narrative, like why there's no sort of family knowledge. If you look back, at least no, and that's not true. There was knowledge, but why it wasn't necessarily broadly showed. So if you look back here, like it's not that far back. So if you think about, right, you know, so here's my grandmother. Like this is her grandfather. This is her great grandfather. So you typically tend to know your great grandparents, or you know of your great grandparents. So it's not really that far back when you think about it. But there is a lot of research that's being done. It's interesting just thinking about how the research is being done. Like as a descendant, I actually went to Georgetown for an exhibit a few weeks ago, and just how you feel about like the research that's being done, and if you're if you're included in the process, and the people you see that are sort of holding all this information, and sort of the gatekeepers, and how that makes you feel.
So we can say that you're building upon the research, right?
I am building upon it. Yes, I'm building upon it.
Kudos to you. And my second question would be, with where you left it off, like, does anti-Blackness, I would like your opinion on, does anti-Blackness get lost in the bigger theme of being anti-racist, right? Because you can pull a lot of other things in when you say anti-racism, but what we are specifically, or what you're specifically talking about, is anti-Blackness, right? Which has its own circumstances around it.
Yeah. So I think you need to really focus on the anti-Blackness aspect, because no other groups were sort of, well, Indigenous people were subjected to other things, but as far as like this codified way, like in which it kind of evolved to address sort of the anti-Blackness of it all, right? So that was sort of like, even that law, like if you were a white woman marrying a Black enslaved person, you were enslaved. Like that's just like you were now tainted by Blackness, right? Like very, very rarely does that happen in other circumstances that you see, like that. It's just even being in proximity of it is enough, as far as anti-Blackness goes. So I think sometimes it does need sort of its own separate lens.
Absolutely. Thank you. The next question, we have Dr. Tanya Thames-Taylor.
Hi there, and thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I actually have two questions. Well, first I have a comment, and then I have two questions. One of the things about I grew up in Mississippi, Gulfport, Mississippi, but I knew my family was who they were owned by, because my family stayed on the plantation because they became sharecroppers by the people who, owned them. And so I know that history. And so that was one part of your presentation. You were saying that when you first learned about the, sort of the connection, it was like, okay, that's interesting. And then when your father got the phone call, it really, ignited that. So now, how have your family's history, how's the trajectory, how has it changed? How has it shifted? So you are informing not only you, but others in your family. Because for me, I'm saying that I was because I was so close to my grandmother, and my grandmother's grandmother was enslaved person. So what happens is that, how now have you, how is your family dealing with this knowledge of this history? And again, prolong it, telling it to the next generation. And then the second question deals with reparations. In essence, this is Georgetown's form of reparation. And what are your overall thoughts on how this, because Georgetown is setting a model for how not only universities, but how institutions can handle reparations. Brown University handled it by creating a center of this dealing with slavery. And so how is how do you think that in this, I mean, how do you think that Georgetown is, in essence, it is a form of reparations, and how do you think that this sets itself as a model? And do you think, because of your own personal experience, your family's personal experience, do you think it's the model that that many people are seeking with reparations, which is some level of acknowledgement and I mean, some people are seeking acknowledgement and also a form of economic remedy through that. So I hope I made my questions clear. If not, I'll just sum up. How is this impacting your family, your conversation moving forward? And do you think that this subtle form of reparation and a model that Georgetown is doing, what is the conversations like in your family about that level of reparation?
Yeah, so thanks for those. So the first, as far as family legacy, it's interesting because my dad's here too. So we have is on the call. So we have I have great aunts, my dad's aunts, who were not particularly, like in their 90s, who were not necessarily particularly interested in this legacy. And I wondered at first why. And I was like, everyone should know this. Everyone should kind of interact with this. And then I realized in doing the research that it takes you to pretty dark places very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so when you really think about like the trauma that this brings up and how you really want to share it, I think it takes serious like consideration and serious really thoughtfulness. So yeah, so I think the idea is to share it. And that's what I've been doing, and letting those who feel comfortable picking up that knowledge to pick it up. But it is traumatic, and there's no doubt about it that when you read about some of the things, when you really grapple with it, you need a lot of self-care, you need a lot of support. And it's not something that you just want to just present, because I mean, like, at least I feel like with you and your situation, you had that wonderful relationship with your grandmother who kind of provided you with that, she had a safe space to kind of disclose it to you. Just making sure that everyone has that sort of foundation, that person to come back to, or that support system to come back to when they're sort of interacting with these things, because it's hard. I mean, I can say from experience, it's really hard. And then to your second point, so I think those things that Georgetown's doing, they would not call them reparations, but I believe that they are sort of some form of reparative reparative work that they're sort of seeking. What's important to note that of those, like around 300 people who were sold, there are now about 11,000 descendants. So that's 11,000 different sort of opinions of what should happen, 11,000 people to sort of do that work and consult. And when my dad got that call back in 2019, it was not from Georgetown. It was from an alumnus who had actually heard about this and actually funded his own genealogical research to find people. So it's notable that Georgetown has these records, but hasn't reached out to actual descendants sort of en masse and sort of engaging in the conversation. So the people in which they're engaging with typically are more educated, have the time and resources to sort of devote to this work, have the support to support this work, but they're not representative of the thousands of people that are out there. And I think that that's important when you're thinking about reparations. Like, yes, a formal apology. I mean, okay, for me, like that's a formal apology, renaming a building. I mean, it's really actually housing all the work, and one of the things I think that would be actually reparative is to actually train people of color to actually work in these spaces, which has not happened so far. And thinking so that when people of color enter these spaces to actually look at these records, that is not necessarily as traumatic. It doesn't feel as like that there's this gatekeeper. However, that's not necessarily what's happening. And another form of reparations that they wouldn't call reparations, but another, I guess, aspect that they've projected is that they give legacy status to in admissions. And legacy status and admissions, if you follow the college admissions, is not really much, especially not at a university like Georgetown. So right now, Georgetown has 2 descendants that are enrolled as undergraduates, and 1 descendant that is enrolled at the law school. And they don't provide, at least for the law school level, they don't provide any more than the standard tuition. And it's also notable that of the plantations in Louisiana, there was a study that was also by Rachel Swarns in the New York Times that actually said that when they offered legacy status, that most of the people who were left behind in those are taken to Louisiana and are still actually present there from those parishes, actually don't have the requisite education to even get into Georgetown. So it's like, so offering that legacy status is really interesting, and that doesn't count. And it also doesn't account for those that were like in Maryland and those that were enslaved in other capacities other than on those plantations. So there's a lot of work to be done. I believe you're right. Brown, Harvard, Rutgers, Towson, William & Mary, there are Clemson, there are tons of universities that are actually looking at their relationships to slavery. They have this consortium, but they're also bringing in resources, right? They're getting grants and they're getting funding that's staying in the university. And to your last point of sort of should some in economic advancement reach out to those descendants? I mean, I think so, but again, I'm one descendant that's speaking for, I can't speak for the over 10,000 of us. So hopefully that addressed your questions.
It did, and thank you so very much. And again, thank you for sharing your honest assessment about when you're looking at some of this. This is, something that, we need support with. So, I mean, you need support. It's not, this is an ongoing conversation, but let me tell you this.
Actually, we have a question for another person we wanted to get in, if that's okay, Tanya.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say from now on out, I'm going to, when I deal with pay equity, I'm going to use this talk as an example of just how racial disparity economically it was institutionalized and hoisted up. And I'm going to use this Georgetown example from this talk from now on out. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I just have one quick comment, Richard, about the economic justice. So if you think the sale was financed because slaves were property, they could be financed, they could be mortgaged, and the bank that actually held that was actually taken over by like J.P. Morgan Chase. So just thinking about how like this is a legacy of money and slavery, and Jamie Dimon's issued an apology, but the economic implications of the sale, like they weren't handled, like there are still people who are profiting from that sale and in business from that sale today.
Thank you. Yeah, like the institution continues to exist primarily because of their ability to from the money from the sale.
Right.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and then banks like institutions like J.P. Morgan Chase, like also are profiting now from that as well.
Yes. So we did have a question from Tracy Jones in the chat. It said, and I know you kind of touched on this, but it was specifically what kinds of finances are they putting into reconciliation? And if any, what are the finances for?
Yeah, so the Jesuits have actually committed to, like the actual Jesuit order has committed to raising, I think maybe $1 billion. They've raised not much money, like to actually form a form of reparations. And Georgetown itself has not committed any finances. However, the students in 2019 voted in a referendum. Let's see, I actually have this here, to raise $400,000 per year for this. And to raise $400,000 per year. And the first rollout of the application was rolled out in November. Applications were due in December. And then the second rollout rolled out in the spring. So one is notable in that it's notable in that the students raised the money. It was not from Georgetown. directly. The other thing to note is that the applications, like there hasn't been any reporting about who's received the applications. And in the application, it really focused on reparative justice. So they were community justice. So like people could file a grant for community justice initiatives. They can deal with people to help people who are unhoused, to help people who have been justice impacted, and just thinking about just how they view Blackness and like kind of this one sort of view, this singular view of, in order to be impacted, you have to sort of be in these kind of in order to be impacted by the legacy of slavery, you sort of have to be in these disadvantaged groups, which I thought was interesting just in how the application was drafted.
Mhm.
And also that we don't know who received any of who or if anyone received anything from that first round.
Okay, thank you. We have some more minutes. Does anybody have another question? I have. Oh, go ahead. Go.
No, you before me, because I could
So-
go on for days.
I have my own like interest in like genealogical research and that type of stuff. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about your own process of doing this genealogical research, especially knowing that the types of genealogical records are different for different racialized groups in terms of like where you can get the memory and where the documents are held.
Right. So Richard Salini, who I mentioned earlier, who was the Georgetown alumnus, he actually hired genealogists to find people. So that was actually a great sort of starting point to have like genealogists who actually did do the genealogy for you. And they actually looked at a variety of marriage and birth records. They looked at censuses post 1870. They looked at what's called property tax relief. So when slavery ended, people actually, like slaveholders, actually filed for property tax relief. Like they wanted to be compensated for actually the taking of their property. So there are actually records that are housed there. So if you're looking for religious records, like Catholics keep great records. So if you are a part of if you are Catholic or even part of another religious organization, there typically tend to be church records starting at burial grounds and cemeteries that like you could start there and sort of work your way back. But I think the easiest way to do it to start, because I've also done like genealogy research on another line that's unrelated to this line, is to start really by talking to people in your family, like the older people in your family, and recording them and just telling them to tell you what they remember about their childhood, where they grew up, what their parents told them about their parents, all these types of things, just to get clues. And I think that's really like the most interesting way to start, and you'll probably get the most valuable information to kind of to take from there. Like, oh, now I know that I know this. I can go to this city. I can see what type of birth and death records they have. I can look in that city's newspaper around that time period. But I think just talking and recording those elders is really important.
Thank you.
Mine is two things. So again, I want to say to the folks that just joined us, give us a day or two and you will see, if you are a member of Ngoma, you'll get a link to see this from the beginning, which I think you should do on YouTube. You can also join if you email me at richard.cooper@widener.edu to make sure you have it. Secondly, Aysha, I'd never put either of your parents on the spot. I just want to thank your father and your mother for being on the call. And I want to just answer your question and ask you a question. Billions would never be enough. They could never do enough in terms of reparations or anything in relationship to your family or to the descendants. Never. But billions would help, millions would help, just in terms of equity. There's nothing that they could actually do. How do you and your family, how have you managed the emotional part of this? You're very poised, and I'm having a problem with the emotional part, and it's not even my kinfolk. How have you all managed that trauma or that emotional knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll let my dad speak too if he wants to speak to it as well. But for me, I mean, it was surprisingly more traumatic than I thought it would be. And they talk about like, the genetics of trauma and how, and it was surprising, like really going into it. And I've been working on this project for a couple of years and just the day in, day out, like when you read about people when you read about a Jesuit priest who gives his daily diary, and in his diary, it includes him, like the dog and the dog's name and the dog running down the river and all these detailed things. And then he'll talk about like some Negro girl, like the girl doesn't even have a name, right? Like, and just thinking out, you could write days about the adventures of your dog, but you can't even bother to mention a name. So yeah, so it's hard. I mean, so it's really hard just being involved in that work and dealing with that sort of trauma, like that you do feel, it does feel traumatic, like it does.
Thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable to share that with us. So thank you. We have,
Oh,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I guess Richard was saying, how we felt about it. I guess the thing that was had the most impact for me was when Aysha visited, the Georgetown, and she met, some descendants, and they were in this, I guess, the center of the library, and they were, like it was time to go, right? Like they said, okay, we're closing, or something to that effect, that it's time to go. And so that sort of hit a nerve for me, in the fact that here's this history that you have in your possession. But here I am, one of the descendants, and I don't have that history. And you have the power to say, I'm opening the door for you and let you in. But you also have the power to say, I'm closing the door because it's time for me to go home. But yet, so those are the things that I think that impacted me the most, out of all the story. Like I said, this is the second time I've heard the presentation. And each time I'm beginning, but that is the one that was most impactful for me, is that when they were there, it was time to go, but yet and still there's still questions and still some things that I felt that needed to be answered. But it was like, okay, it's 5 o'clock, it's time for us to go. So which in turn, that sort of, I think that impacted me the most.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. It's about 12. I guess we have one more question.
And I'm sorry, Miss Lola, I'm sorry that happened. This is Tanya Timms Taylor. I want to sit in that. I'm going to sit in that when we leave this presentation. Like you said, here you are, I built this, and then you telling me, you give me access in, but then you also point me out. I'm going to take that away, and thank you for sharing that. And I'm sorry that process happened.
But I'm just,
I know,
yeah, I just wanted to say that that was it, that it's that, and it goes back to what Aysha said earlier. It's about, that power is who controls the power, that is technically it is your history, but somebody else is controlling the power to your history, can say what's available to you and what's not.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to end on that note, though.
Thank you.
Mm.
We actually have another question that just came in on the chat from Tracy Jones. How do you honor the descendants in a formalized way to memorialize their contributions and trials?
Yeah, so I think what I'm trying to do now is tell NACE's story. I think that's how you memorialize it. You memorialize them. You allow their stories to be told. You allow them to be people and not just some Negro in a book. or run a manifest.
And it's also interesting it's also interesting too, is that as as these, as the enslaved population are being described in these narratives, and how, the worth and the intelligence, but it's also, it's interesting to see where some of those descendants are now. Where are they now, professionally, but where are they now, and what are they contributing, so, and I think that's also something interesting to bring in there. But yeah, it was traumatic for me, just to, even the first time, I heard about, what, 3 or 4 weeks ago, heard the presentation. That we have conversations, but that was the first time that I actually saw the presentation. And so it was very impactful for me.
Yeah, I think we've all seen the PBS show where Skip Gates takes people back to their ancestors, and we see that, like, that emotional reaction that they have. This is for your family, for everybody. This is so powerful, just the emotional part. And I know we have to end, but Aysha, when you said, "Oh, I first heard about it," was kind of like matter of fact, as most of us would be, and then all of a sudden you find it's you. And you're
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Amazing. Thank you.
And also the historical piece with Nace and where he was politically. And so, so all, like a lot of times we don't know that information, that, that you have, a political representative within your family. And so, and everything now just becomes such much more important. And this is her dad's side. So this is much more important,
Yes. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to Aysha Ames for sharing your presentation, for sharing this, family history, and, like I said, being vulnerable to share it with us, and just thank you. And thank you to everyone who came in support, and a bunch of thank yous, excellent presentation, so much for me to think about with regards to your presentation. So thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Yes. All right. Everyone have a good day. Good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you.